Okay, thank you for joining us for the NSECE webinar, Schedules of Work and Childcare in the National Survey of Early Care and Education. The point of this webinar is to introduce the NSECE Household Survey Calendar data, to describe issues related to how to make use of the parental employment data, including how to connect those data with data about what children are doing throughout their week, including when their parents are at work, and further to highlight research questions that you might pursue as researchers that can take advantage of the parental work schedule data themselves, the combination of the parents' calendar and children's early care and education calendars, or perhaps other aspects of research that can be conducted using these data. To achieve those purposes, we will quickly overview the NSECE design, especially the design of the household survey and its contents. We will talk about what kinds of research can be conducted about parental employment using the calendar data in particular. Then we'll get into some of the nuts and bolts of how this calendar is structured, how we use those data. We will give some examples of variables that can be created using the calendar data, and then we'll provide information about how you can direct your questions or find additional information about the calendar data. Let's begin just with some background on the study itself. So the National Survey of Early Care and Education was sponsored by the Office of Planning, Research, and Evaluation in the Administration for Children and Families. Our federal project officer is Ivelisse Martinez-Beck. This is Rupa Datta of NORC. I'm the project director, and will be conducting today's webinar with my colleague Carolina Milesi, who is also here at NORC with me. As you can see from the slide, there was a very large team of researchers who participated in the construction of the data files and are now users of the data and potential resources for understanding better how these data work. The NSECE was designed to address several important policy needs having to do with the work of the Administration for Children and Families. In particular, there were no comprehensive national data, especially about the supply of early care and education. In addition, although there were household survey data, there were not data that linked households to the access that they had locally to providers. As we know, households in California are not helped by having centers in Virginia, and yet what data there were about supply were often at such a high level that they couldn't be linked to local household data. And so it was very important to the agency to understand all families with age-eligible children in a particular location. Much of the data that existed was about specific programs, so children participating in Head Start, or children of working parents. And so some of the most important policy needs were to understand comprehensively the full spectrum of families or providers that were available. And in terms of understanding the supply, both center-based providers of care were important, as well as home-based providers of care who were known to provide a vast proportion of the care that children receive, but no one really knew what proportion. And then also the issues of the workforce, characterizing accurately the workforce of teachers and caregivers in early care and education was a critical objective. And as I mentioned, doing all of this in a way that could connect supply, demand, and the workforce at a level below the national summary statistics. So in response to these policy needs, the NSECE was designed as an integrated set of 4 surveys. Today we will be talking primarily about the household survey, which is a survey of all households with children under 13, which is a survey representing all households with children under 13. The other 3 surveys in the suite are of home-based providers, regularly providing care to children under 13, center-based providers providing ECE to children not yet in kindergarten, and the staff who work in those centers. The data were collected in 2012. So since this topic is about the household survey, we'll spend a few moments with some of the basic details about that survey. The NSECE household survey data file covers 11,629 households, who amongst them include 21,665 children under 13. The data were collected between January and June in 2012, and because low-income families are of such great policy interest, especially to ACF, there was an oversample of households in low-income areas. Please note that a household in a low-income area may not itself be a low-income household, but rather a household who lives in an area with many other households who have low incomes. The respondent of the household survey was an individual who was knowledgeable about the early care and education usage and schedule of the youngest child in the household. So most commonly, there was a mother, could have also been a father. In more rare circumstances, it might have been a stepmother or grandmother or another guardian or adult. So as we talk about different units of observation within the survey, we'll talk about different adults on whom we have employment data. We'll talk about different children. It's important to keep in mind that although we have data about various members of the household, they all come from one respondent who was reporting about generally herself, as well as a proxy of her spouse, other adults in the household, as well as the children in the household. The topics of the household survey questionnaire included basic household characteristics, like who lived in the household, income, the type of dwelling, things like that. We collected data on the perceptions of different types of care and the actual most recent search for ECE. We asked questions about the cost to the household of their regular ECE arrangements, as well as their current usage of both regular and irregular care. Data are collected individually for each child under 13. And as I mentioned, there's no focal child in the study, so every child under 13 was treated equally within the household. And then the focus of today's presentation is really on the calendar, which focused on activities during the prior week. So the interview was conducted sometime between January and June of 2012, and whatever day of the week the interview took place, we asked about the prior week from Monday to Sunday. And there were questions about each child, and we generally described that as the child calendar. And we asked questions about the work-related activities of parents and resident caregivers, and we used the nickname adult calendar for that set of information. You'll find that the calendar data themselves can't really be used without linking them to something else within the household survey data. They're very detailed information about activities in the prior week, but they're not analytically useful generally without linking to something else. And so it might be useful to think about what the other types of data are within the survey that can be used in conjunction. And so, for example, we have a unit of observation, a set of data about the respondent, who, as we said, was generally the mother, but could have been another adult in the household. So the respondent's work schedule, demographics, things like that are available. There are data about other household members, both adults and children. There are household level data, and so analyses can be done at the level of the household, for example, income and program participation data. There are both parents and caregivers in the adult calendar. I should mention those are resident caregivers, people who live within the household. As I said, there are data on the most recent search for ECE. Each child under 13 can be treated as a separate unit of observation, and so analyses can be done at the child level as well as the adult household level. And then two other units of observation about which there are a great deal of richness of information are the providers used by the household in the prior week, as well as all regular arrangements, by which we mean the combination of a provider with a child. That pair we call the arrangement. Okay, well, that is the introduction to the household survey. I'll turn it over now to Carolina, who will talk more specifically about the parental employment data.
So we will cover the details of the adult calendar later in the webinar, but we first wanted to give you some examples of what you can learn about parental employment from the NSECE household survey, and what are the substantive issues you could tackle based on this data. The adult calendar data are very rich, and you could examine multiple issues regarding parental employment. So we will just give you a couple of examples that you could use to spark your interest in using the data. So based on data from the adult calendar, you could ask what are the characteristics of households in which parents work non-standard hours. And for this question, you would need to use data of the adult calendar combined with data from the household data file. Another question you could ask is, do parents of young children have different work schedules from parents of older children? And here you would combine data from the adult calendar with data on children characteristics in the main household data file. So note that in both questions, the issue is not just the number of hours that parents work, but the timing of work, or in other words, when does that work take place? And the issue of timing is something that the calendar data are particularly well suited to address, because you have data, not just a summary of a report on the number of hours, but actually how that work unfolded throughout the reference week. So in this slide, you can see two examples of questions you can address using the combination of adult calendar and child calendar. The first question is, what types of non-parental care do children experience when parents are at work, school, or training? And does this vary by child's age? So note here that you could address this question as differences between households and also as differences within households, since the NSECE includes all children under age 13 in the household and not just a focal child. So, households may prioritize or may allocate resources depending on children's age, for instance, and you are able to do that using the NSECE data. The second question that's set as an example here is, what are the characteristics of households with all parents employed in which children have no regular non-parental care? So imagine a household in which both parents work and children spend no hours in regular non-parental care. Is parental care similarly the same for each parent? Is the work schedule of these parents different than those parents whose children have regular non-parental care? So these are some of the substantive issues the NSECE household data would allow you to explore. So in this section, I will now cover the content and the mechanics of the calendar file. As Rupa had mentioned, the core of the calendar, the adult calendar, regards parental employment and school schedule for the prior week. And there are three key elements to the code frame. There is work. You would know whether the parent or the caregiver was in school or in training, And then the inferred category of all these three is no work, school, or training. So note here that you would know that the parent was either at work, or this is the caregiver, or the parent was either at work, school, or training, and then something else, but you wouldn't know specifically what that something else was. And commuting was included in the report of work, school, or training. The data was captured in 15-minute increments for the entire reference week, and as Rupa had mentioned, the reference week is Monday from midnight to 12 a.m. to Sunday 11:59 p.m. of the week immediately prior to the week of the interview. So that's for the content, and then this slide shows the original questions asked to the respondent of the household questionnaire. And I will go through each question so that you understand how the adult calendar data was captured. So the first question is asked to the respondent of the household questionnaire is thinking about last, let's say Monday, did you go to work, school, or training? And then there will be a drop-down menu with all those three options. At what time did you begin work, school, or training on that last Monday? Please include the time you spent commuting to and from work, school, or training in your response, and the interviewer would record the start time. Then, at what time did you end that work, school, or training on that last Monday? And the interviewer would record the end time. And did you attend work, school, or training any other time that day? So, the activities are reported iteratively up to 5 spells per day. And for each activity, the interviewer collected information on the start time and the end time. And these activities were captured for the respondent and also for the relevant adults in the household that I will refer to in a minute. So this is the core of the adult calendar. These are the core questions, and then you will see how the data was structured. So in this slide, you see how the collection of the calendar was aligned between what we are referring to as the adult calendar and the child calendar. So let me walk you through these examples. So in the first 2 rows refer to the respondent and other adult in the household. The last 2 rows here refer to 2 children in the household. This is a totally hypothetical household, by the way. The columns represent 5 different time slots. Each of them covers 15 minutes. And the time displayed represents the start time of each slot. So you see 8 a.m., 8:15, and then there's something in between, a lot of time in between, 3:30, 5 p.m., and 10 p.m. So as an example, you could see that at 5 p.m., the parent was working, the second adult was also working, child 1 was at a play date with Chloe, and child 2 was being taken care for by Nanny Rosie. So based on this data, you could create multiple variables, such as the number of hours that each adult is at work, each particular day of the week, whether those hours are at the same during the weekday versus the weekend, whether the children were with parents, where the children were when parents were at work, who was providing care where one of both parents were at work, and whether the providers were consistent throughout the week. So all those variables you could create by aligning the child calendar with the adult calendar. And in terms of analysis, it's important to know that the slots are the same for the adult and the children. So this feature of the data collection is what allows users to analyze the intersection of adult and children's schedules. So in this slide, there are 2 key issues that I will refer to. The key one here is who was the adult calendar data collected about. So as Rupa referred to, the adult calendar was reported by the same person who responded to the entire household questionnaire. And that person reported on anyone whose work, school, or training may be affected by childcare. So that may or may not coincide with all household members, and it may likely be a subset of the household members in the household. So the adult calendar was collected for the respondent to the household questionnaire, his or her spouse, any parent of an eligible child who was living in the household under age 13, and any household member age 13 or older who regularly provided 5 or more hours of care to eligible children in the household. So for instance, in this last category, you would capture an older sibling or a grandmother or an uncle or an aunt who provides care for children under age 13 in the household. And so this may mean that even though we refer to the adult calendar as quote-unquote the adult calendar, you may have here non-adults, such as an older sibling age 17 or 16 who takes care of a younger sibling under age 13 in the household. And based on the definition of who are the eligible adults for the household, you would also note that some household members who live in the household would not be included. So for instance, the adult brother of a respondent who does not provide for care for the children on a regular basis, he would not be included in the adult calendar, but he would be included in the household roster, and there would be information about that person in the household roster. So from an analysis point of view, the set of adults with available data in the adult calendar are not necessarily a meaningful universe. You would probably need data from the main household data file to link it to the adult calendar to know who those adults were and whether they belong or do not belong to your analysis and your relevant analytic sample. And the last point of the slide is again to remind you that the reference week is Monday through Sunday of the week most recently preceding the interview date. So there, as I had alluded to, there is additional information about adults in the household in the main household data file. There is demographic information on each adult, such as sex, age, race, ethnicity, relationship to the questionnaire respondent, and relationship to children. And there is a lot of household level information that you could also link to the adult calendar, such as income, household composition, geographic location, and characteristics of the communities where the households are located. Some of the geographic location information will be available in the public use file, and some of it will be available in the restricted use file, depending on the level of detail. There is also a lot of additional information about parental employment in the main household data file. So in the adult calendar, you know where they were, but in the main data file, you would know the characteristics of that employment, such as occupation, industry, wage, hours per week, advance notice for days or hours needed at work, distance from the household to the workplace, and scheduled changes in the last 3 months that are due to childcare-related reasons, such as missed days of work because of the child being sick, or working late or leaving early because of childcare-related reasons. And in the main household data file, you're also able to identify parents among all those household adults. So some of the household adults that provide care for children may not be the parents of those households, and you would identify those relationships in the main data file. So a note about the calendar data file. The calendar data file are included in a separate file from the main household file, and the data is entirely public, and you could download the data from the Research Connections link that is provided in the deck of slides. The calendar file is structured as a large rectangular file in which there is one record per household, so the file will have 11,629 records. An adult and child calendar are set up as separate variables for each of the 15-minute time slots. So there is a lot of variables, almost 16,000 variables, and there are some of the variables are not particularly meaningful because there are up to 9 children per household and up to 12 adults per household. And for households that do not have those many children or those many adults, those variables will be empty. But all the data is there. it's very likely that you may have to restructure the file in a way that suits your analytic purposes. You could restructure the file, for instance, as a child level file. You could restructure the file as a day file in which each record is a day per child, or you could restructure it as with a very small category, such as a time slot level, and then create your variables at that level, and then reshape it again, restructure it again at the child level. It's also very likely that you will have to merge the calendar file with the main household data file that we have been discussing here. The merging is very easy because both files have the same ID, and it's also easy because children and adults have the same index numbers across files to facilitate linkage. So the household member number 3 in the calendar is also household member number 3 in the main household data file, and child number 5 in the calendar is also child number 5 in the main household data file. It's important for users to know that they should use weights when generating estimates in order to account for the complex NSECE design, and the calendar data file can be used with either the household level file, the household level weight, or the child level sampling weight, depending on the analysis that the user undertakes. So, for instance, you would need the child level weight if you are asking about whether each child in the household experiences parents with a particular work schedule, and you would need the household level weight if you are asking whether any child in the household experiences the same non-parental care, or how do households with 2 parents organize their work schedules as opposed to households with 1 parent. To conclude this section, there are a couple of potential limitations that users should be aware of. As I had mentioned, parents' activities other than work, school, training are not known. Commuting time is included in the respondent's report of work, school, or training. The data, as Rupa had mentioned, was collected between January and June of 2012. So if you are interested in particular industries or occupations that have seasonal employment that is not captured by that time, you would need to be aware of that. And you would need some computing processing time needed to work with the calendar data. So here again, I will recommend that you restructure the data in a way that facilitates the variable creation and analysis. And with that, I turn it over to Rupa.
So we thought it would be helpful to actually show an example analysis that makes use of these data to give you some taste of the types of things we can learn. What I'll be presenting to you here are child level estimates that derive constructs from the adult calendar and that are focused on children ages 0 through 60 months, living in households with either 1 or 2 adults. So we begin by looking at the total number of work-related hours that parents spent in the reference week. So there's a lot going on this slide. Let me orient you briefly to it. On the vertical axis, we have the total number of hours worked by all of the parents in the household. And then the horizontal axis gives you sets of bars that characterize households. So the first set of bars is for all working households. So at least 1 parent is working in each household that we show. In the second set of bars, now we're looking at households in which there is exactly 1 parent, and that parent is a working parent. The next set is when there are 2 parents in the household, but exactly 1 of them is working. So we have 1 parent who had work-related activities in the prior week, and 1 parent who did not have work-related activities in the prior week. And then the final set of bars is for 2-parent households in which both parents are working. So now we've got, we're distinguishing between households. We're looking at household structure, whether there's 1 parent or 2 parent in the household, as well as what fraction of the parents in the household are working. And then the final dimension that we have here is the household's income to poverty ratio. And so we are showing the different colored bars for households where we compare their income in 2011 to the federal poverty threshold for a household of their magnitude, of their size. And so, for example, we see in the first set of bars that across all working households that had a child between 0 and 60 months, on average, the combined number of hours worked by parents was 58. So 58 hours of work in the reference week. That it comes from, for example, on average 37 hours in the week for a single parent who is working, combined with 47 hours per week for the sole working parent in a two-parent household, and 80 hours for the two-parent, two-worker household. So just pausing there for a moment, you see that the single working parent was working on average 37 hours. In the two-parent, two-worker household, the combined total 80 would suggest an average of about 40 hours per working adult. But where there are two parents and only one worker, there's a greater 47 hours of work in the week. So when you have an extra parent, the working parent is able to work more hours. Roughly speaking, for all working households, which is the leftmost set of bars, as well as for the two working parent households, which are the rightmost bars, you see an increase in hours of work by income category, so that the highest income households are working more hours than lower income households, although all of the parents, on average, every category of parent is working significant numbers of hours per week. The lowest average we see across any of these categories is 33 hours per week among parents, single working parents in poor households. Okay, so these are child level estimates for the total number of hours that their parents worked in the reference week. Now we are going to look at this next slide. Of those hours that we just looked at, what fraction of them were worked during non-standard hours? And so we use the definition that appears in much of the literature. So Monday through Friday, 8 a.m. through 6 p.m. are defined as standard hours, and everything else, evenings, weekends, early mornings or late nights, are considered non-standard hours. And here we see that, for example, across all children 0 to 60 months who are in working households, so who have at least one working parent in the reference week, across all children, they experienced 14 hours when at least one parent was working during a non-standard hour. And you see that the dark blue bars are the ones for the highest income households, and typically across all of the household structures, those highest income households are working the fewest non-standard hours compared to the lower income households. But we also see that across all of these groups, there is some work during non-standard hours on average for every single group. Okay, so the two estimates that I just showed you, total number of hours worked, as well as total number of non-standard hours worked, could be generated from a variety of data sources. You can, from summary survey data, generate those numbers. What we're going to show you now actually can only be generated using the type of data that we've collected and make available in the adult calendar data. So what we've done here now is focus not just on the total number of hours, but on the relationship of those hours during the day and during the week to one another. So the question is, how many hours per week are all parents in the household working? For a single parent, single worker household, this is the same as any hour that they're working. That's if there's only one parent and that person is working, then whenever that person is working, all the parents in the household are working. However, the concept is more interesting for two-parent, two-worker households. Here, we can think about whether the parents are working all of their hours at the same time or whether they are staggering their work schedules in different ways. So you might recall that in the prior slide, we saw that the total number of hours on average being worked by two-parent, two-worker households was 80 hours. So children were experiencing 80 hours of parental work if they were in a two-parent, two-worker household. Now, if you just think about that, if you have two parents who are working a total of 80 hours, then if they worked exactly the same schedule, then you would have 40 hours when they were both at work. But what we see on this slide is that those children are experiencing 22 hours when both of their parents are at work, suggesting that the remaining time one of the parents is at work, but the other one is not, or of course it could be the case that neither parent is at work. And so this is a significant shift from what you might expect if parents were working exactly the same, say, standard work schedule. And so although in what we were seeing previously was that each working parent works similar numbers of hours, something between 30 and 40 on average, here you see that children in single-parent households with working parents are experiencing, on average, 37 hours when their only parent is at work, when they have no parents at home. In contrast, if you're a child in a two-parent, two-working parent household, in fact, you have, on average, 22 hours when all of the parents in the household are at work. We can think about this as a hint of when parents need childcare to support their parental employment, and you can see that single working parents would need much more time to support their employment than two-parent households would need to support their employment even when both parents are working. Okay, so that's an illustration of how these data can be used in conjunction with one another to learn things that we've really not been able to measure previously. Because we presume that you're researchers, you would probably like to know a little bit more about what types of analyses might be feasible. What this slide tells you is basically the unweighted numbers of cases that we had available to generate the slides that you just saw. So, for example, in our sample, if you restrict to the number of children who are between 0 and 60 months old, who have exactly one or two parents in the household, we see that there are a total of 7,900 such children, 7,918. And because of the significant oversample of households in low-income areas, you see that 38 of them are living in poverty. And that's in that less than 100% column. You can see that we have about twice as many children in single-parent households as in two-parent households. About twice as many children, almost 4,000, who are living in a household with exactly one parent who works, compared to about 2,000 children who are living in a household with two parents who work. Of course, there are a variety of ways to have one working parent. One of them is to be in a single-parent household where that one parent works. Another is to live in a two-parent household where one of the parents is engaged in work-related activities. Okay, well, that is a quick introduction to the parental employment data. If you have questions about the data and how you can use them, we would refer you first to the NSECE resources page at Research Connections, which is linked here, and which is constantly growing with new and different resources about how to make use of the data. We have available a video that shows how the interview data were actually collected. We showed you a slide with a little demo, but you can actually go through the entire interview to better understand those dynamics. And we always welcome questions about the data and how to use them, and you can get that help by emailing us at nscce@norc.org, as you see on this slide. Thank you very much.